那么接下来我们今天的最后一个讲座呢，是穿越时空的独立游戏行销法则。那俗称太空狼人杀 Among Us 开发团队的Innersloth 的社群总监来为我们主讲。那他也是 Wholesome Games 的组织者，还有担任疗愈游戏 Unpacking 的社群策略师，参与了 Boyfriend Dungeon、矮人堡垒、Paparazzi 等专案。那今天他要跟大家分享的是呢，独立游戏开发团队最苦恼的就是没有足够的资金、没有足够的时间预算去做行销，去做让大家知道你的游戏。那作品应该要如何被看见，然后建立社群，还有应该专注在哪些推广行为？那今天我们的主讲人呢都会分享给大家，让我们掌声欢迎 Victoria Tran。
Hello? Okay. Hello. As he said, I'm Victoria Tran. I'm very excited to be here. It's my first time in Taipei. I've had 2 bubble teas every single day. I'm very full, but it's delicious and I love it here. But thank you so much for having me. I will be here to talk to you about marketing your indie game throughout time and space. We have a lot to go through, but I hope it's very helpful to you. So I think I already had a really good introduction, I think. I didn't understand it, but I trust that it's amazing. So hello, I'm Victoria Tran again. I'm the community director at Innersloth. I work on a game called Among Us. I am also a Wholesome Games organizer. Wholesome Games is an organization that chooses to, oh my goodness. Wholesome Games is basically an organization where we try to uplift and showcase a lot of games with positive and uplifting messages. And we do a little showcase for that called Wholesome Direct. I also work with a lot of indie games. I'm a summit advisor at GDC for community management. So I do a lot of marketing, a lot of community with indies. You can find me at victoriatran.com for all the stuff that I do, including a newsletter about community and marketing, or on Twitter if it doesn't explode within the next hour, I suppose, at the VTran. But we have a lot to talk about. As I said, this is a table of contents. We will be talking about pre-production, the announcement, the wait, basically when you're creating your game, and launch, and all of the little marketing nitty-gritty that happens there. There will be a lot of information on these slides, and I will be sending these slides later, so don't worry if you can't write everything down. There's going to be a lot. So one thing I did want to note before I get into any of the marketing stuff is that I do have a lot of biases because I come from a different place, right? So I live in North America. My main and only language is English. So the kinds of resources that are out there for me and that are available to you or that I think are right won't necessarily be true here. But I think there is a lot of things that kind of work no matter where you are, and I hope you find it quite helpful for you. So, getting right to it. Pre-production. This is when you are kind of trying to determine if the game idea you're working on is the game idea that is potentially right for the market at the right time, in the right space, etc. And to do this, the goal when we do pre-production marketing is to understand the potential viability of the game. Usually what we do, and there's a lot that goes into it, is a competitor analysis, a SWOT, which is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and customer profiles, which I will be going through. One of the things before we get into this is to also know what your own studio's goals and success metrics are. So some studios want to make a ton of money. Some are okay if they can just make enough money to fund their next game. Some are looking to find a publisher. And some just want to make really cool like art style indie games. And no matter what you choose to do, that is whatever you like. But it will kind of change how you do your competitor analysis. So make sure you check on that. So a competitor analysis is basically where you examine similar games in the industry to gain insight into their offerings, what their messaging is, their brand, their sales, marketing approaches. And when I say competitor, it is a game that is in development or released within 3 years. you can choose a game that is like released 10 years ago, but it might not be very useful to you. That's more of a benchmark and a success metric for you. So what does competitor analysis actually do for you, and why would we want to do it? First is viability, as I have said before. So is it actually something that you should be working on? Does it have potential in the market? So you can look at the different platforms it's available on, the genre saturation, so how many games in this genre are actually there, and the actual audience size. How many people are playing this game? How much interest is there in this game genre? Next is the marketing. So how you will differentiate your game from all the other games and the messaging angles in which you will do that. So every game is marketed a different way. Competitor analysis will help you choose the one that's right for you. And finally, insights. So player sentiments, pricing, gameplay length, all of the little nitty-gritty items that you might want to learn about is a really helpful thing that competitor analysis can do for you. All right, so this is just a screenshot from SteamDB. There are a lot of places where you can find competitors. SteamDB, these are all websites. SteamDB.com, Games Like Finder, VG Insights. You can also look at press. So what kinds of games are journalists writing about? What are influencers playing? Kickstarter, if you're doing crowdfunding, like what kinds of games are being made, what kinds of games are being pushed. This is all dependent, again, on the game you are trying to make, so find something that is right for you. But how do we use this information? Because we can gather it quite a bit, but if you don't know how to use it, it doesn't really make sense. So the first thing is that you can usually find the demand of a game by checking the average number of reviews. We have something called the new Boxletier number, and this is a really super rough calculation of how many sales that this game has had. And we usually calculate this with Steam because it is the most available public-facing information that we have. So an average of 41 sales per review, so for every one review, you can calculate 41 sales, average, and then a median of 38 sales per review. Again, this is really rough. It is not perfect. Do not use it as your main thing, but it is good to get a really rough sense. From the average review score, you can kind of see the quality of the game of your competitor, and then the average price. So what are players actually expecting to pay for a game of this length, of this quality, of this art style, all the different things that kind of work with the psychology of a player. One note about money when you're calculating the actual sales of the game, though, because this is very important, please be wary of things like sales or discounts. So some games will have free weekends. Some games will have something where they'll put their game on like 90% off, and this will change the numbers of the game reviews and the number of things that you think it has sold. There's also publisher cuts and platform fees. Sometimes they take 30%, and that's a really big cut of money. So when you're calculating your own game's success, you want to really look into that. There's sometimes bundles. Sometimes games will bundle together, or there will be a platform like Humble that does Humble Bundle, which will release a bunch of games together for free. And then taxes, because a lot of studios, when they're calculating a game's viability, forget to kind of add in taxes, and that can take away from a lot of your sales. And after you do all of that work, it should look something like this, but maybe bigger. This is one that we did for Boyfriend Dungeon, which is another game that I've worked on. It can be much more extensive than this. I just wanted to do a really quick snapshot of what you might see. It can be done on Excel. It can be done on whatever platform you like, so long as you have a place where you are tracking this and you can calculate it and you can easily see what is going on in the genre that you are focusing on. All right. Next, once you have your competitor analysis, you can start going to a SWOT. And again, these are a lot of questions, but it is really important. So SWOT, again, stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And this is what you look for both your game and your studio. These are questions that you want to ask yourself to leverage both your strengths and opportunities and understand the risks and threats when it comes to the game that you want to make. And these look at both internal and external factors. So for strengths, for example, when you're making your game, what does it do best? What is your studio really good at? Maybe you have a really strong art style. Maybe you have really strong technical design. What experience can players get from it? Then the weaknesses, because there are always weaknesses and you don't want to ignore them, is what can competitors do better, where are you lacking, and what does your game not do? Because your game can't be everything to everyone all at once, so pick and choose. Next is opportunities, so any underserved markets, if you have a new mechanic or style, or you can see a gap in the market as you do your competitor analysis, this can be really helpful. And then any threats, so there's always new games coming out, which ones are potentially competitors for you, any discoverability challenges or changes, and if you have a lack of resources and time. And if you're an indie developer, you probably do. And this applies whether or not you have a publisher, right? So, one thing about localization is that if you're doing a game with narrative or like really complicated skill trees or like a card system with like a lot of skills, it's going to add up. So if you have multiple markets, there's going to be multiple languages, any slang, cultural references, jokes, made up words, those also are part of it. And the more complicated the script, the more complicated the localization. And obviously this is something that all of us must deal with, and it's quite difficult. And as someone who has played a lot of like overseas games, sometimes I don't understand the English translation of the skills because it just gets really jumbled and difficult to understand. So just keep that in mind if you're creating a game. All right, finally, we want to dive into what our players actually are and what they want. The first part of marketing is truly very in-depth that a lot of people don't get to see. This is the invisible part of marketing. So I recommend identifying at least 2 core motivations and exploring how you can market your game towards these. If you try to be everything to everyone all at once, again, it gets really messy and people don't actually understand what you're trying to give to them and what the experience is supposed to be. This one is from Conchic Foundry. It labels the gamer motivations of action, social, mastery, achievement, immersion, creativity. I recommend picking one of the 2 from this list to just really focus on. And some genres can be really complementary. So for instance, if I really like playing roguelikes, I will often go and try to find more roguelikes to play. However, if I play an MMO, I'm usually only playing one MMO because the time investment it takes to play 2 MMOs is something that I don't have. So when you are creating your game, just kind of note how difficult it would be to break into that market and that genre. And then once you can kind of find that gamer motivation model and you can tweak your messaging towards these sorts of things, this is how you find what your players will value and what you can do for them. Okay, so you've done your pre-production, you're all ready now. It's time to announce that your game exists. The goals here is to really bring hype to your game announcement, to understand how to frame your game when people are checking it out and what they should actually do. And this is what we call a call to action. The activities we do here that I will mainly outline, there are a lot of activities, but the main ones are going to be working on a trailer, the actual hype work, talking to press, and seeing if you can get on a showcase, because usually that's quite helpful for people, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about this. So when you announce a game, you want to make sure it has the best chance of survival. Especially when it comes to the first time someone hears about it, you want to make sure you're able to convey its ideas and what's cool about it succinctly as possible. And to do that, you need a really great game, a game hook, a trailer, and some nice imagery, usually for your store page. The hook is the thing about a game that is so intriguing that it will attract the player, the viewer, to draw them in and learn more about it. It's very similar to the first impression. So the game hook can be many different things, right? So I've worked on a game called Boyfriend Dungeon. That's a very weird title, and it makes people want to learn a lot more about it. And all of these things can work together in tandem, or they can just be by themselves. But either way, the more game hooks you have, the easier it is to pitch your game to people. Next is having really good visuals. It can be really interesting. It can be distinctly beautiful. It can be something that someone has never seen before. There's theme and story, right? Everyone loves a cult, I guess. Cult of the Lamb was very, very fun. You have audio, so Crypt of the Necrodancer had very distinct audio that people quite enjoyed. Emotion is a little bit more difficult to get sometimes because it's hard to convey emotion so succinctly in a game hook. Again, a game hook will take like 5 seconds for someone to latch onto. But something like Spiritfarer, which is a game about death, and dying, a wholesome game about death and dying, is quite interesting to people. It can be familiarity, so if you know a farming simulator and you see a farming game, that can be something that's very, very interesting to you. Uniqueness, so a uniqueness in theme, in mechanics, in narrative. Really anything goes with uniqueness, but this one's a little bit more difficult to nail because oftentimes we get really caught up in what we think is unique versus what people actually think is unique. And then the fame of a developer, studio, or franchise. So for example, if I were to say there's an Among Us 2, which there is no Among Us 2, this is not a secret announcement, so please don't talk about that. If I were to say there was an Among Us 2, it requires a little bit less explanation because people tend to know what the first Among Us is. Next, when you have your game hook, you can start working on a trailer. And this is very important. People love trailers. People use it for everything. Social media, hype, press, influencers, store page. People look at it. It's one of the main things you will do in your marketing journey. If you want to hire someone to do your trailer for you, the costs can be quite large. It can go from 1,000 to 20,000 USD. And the cost depends on the experience and the amount of work you are asking for. But keep that in mind when you are going to pitch. Obviously, someone in your studio can also make the trailer. But again, if you want someone to make it for you, this is the cost, at least in North America. There are some trailer tips from the person who helps make some of our trailers, plus a lot of other amazing AAA and indie trailers, Derek Liu. He recommends if you are trying to make your own trailer, first, definitely show the game loop. Second, show variety in your gameplay. The UI and HUD should be on. So a lot of people like to turn it off because they don't think it's very pretty, but the UI is actually a really important way that help people understand how your game is actually played. Make sure it's simple and easy to understand, no logos of your studio until the end slate, and no cinematic shots with no player interaction. A lot of people love to show off their environments as like the first 10, 15, 30 seconds, but really a lot of scenery doesn't do anything for someone. They want to know what are they doing in the game, and that is what the trailer should be showing. Next, once you have all of that, you can start building your store page. I'm using Steam as an example because it's one of the easiest ones and one of the ones we use the most. Your game hook will be really helpful for the short description of the page. And consider, did I turn this off? Hello? Okay, we're good. And consider that when people are looking at the store page, they usually are only looking at the top. Very rarely will people scroll down. If they scroll down, they're interested enough that they sort of want to learn more, but oftentimes they're just clicking through the screenshots. So you want to make sure that the first thing that they see is very distinctly appealing and informative as possible. Next, when you are working on your store page, you'll often have something like a capsule. So this is like on the main Steam page, right? And then you'll see that if you're scrolling down, they have like tiny images that show off what the game is. This is one of the most important things because, again, it is the way you will hook people into clicking to learn more about your game. One of my favorite things to do is I'll just Photoshop one of these capsules out, replace it with my own capsule, and just see how it compares in quality, in color, in game title, like sizing, to everything else, because that will help you determine if it works or not. When it comes to the long description of the game, GIFs are a fantastic way to convey what your game is like. Many people don't, again, bother watching the trailer. They often will just click through screenshots, and they really want just a really quick way, because there are so many games out there, to see what your game is about and how it plays. So help people out with as many nice, helpful visuals as possible. So not just scenic, include the gameplay. Once we have those items, we want to make sure we announce it in a place that's going to cause the most amount of chatter as possible. Usually this means being a part of a showcase or event, if we can. And you really want to find out how gamers in your local market discover and purchase new games. So if it's on the App Store, if it's on Steam, through word of mouth, then focus your marketing efforts on those channels. So this is a lot of events, don't worry about this. But these are just a really small example of the kinds of showcases that are out there. Obviously, some of these aren't going to be very useful. For instance, if you aren't on Nintendo, you will not be part of the Nintendo Direct. So keep that in mind. But having those relationships with platforms, having those relationships and knowing kind of what showcases are out there, and if you can align with any of those and get in with any of those, it's really helpful, because oftentimes when we as indies are doing marketing, we are really separated into our own bubbles, and showcases like this get us out of those bubbles. So some of these things, like the PC Gaming Show, the Future Game Show, they will have paid slots. I tend to recommend not paying for these slots because it's very expensive. It can be like $50,000 for 30 seconds is actually quite cheap considering these, so it can go upwards and onwards. And as an indie, tend to not have that kind of marketing budget. So instead, I try to go and would recommend to see if you can find smaller showcases, especially local showcases. Those can be amazing. For instance, Wholesome Direct, which is a thing I work on, is free and is obviously themed, so it might not work for every game. But it is a smaller showcase that will get you in front of an audience that is probably more likely and more willing to learn about your game because it's directed towards them. But if you can't be part of an event and you're just announcing it by yourself, or want to make an extra special boost when you're announcing your game, that's when press comes in. So we will talk a little bit about press. When you're emailing press, please make sure you have a very good press kit. This is a kit that gives press all the things they need to talk about your game. And the more difficult it is for press to talk about your game, the less likely it is they're going to talk about you. Don't need to write this all down. Don't worry about it. But a press kit will basically have things like studio, game logo, key art, trailers, screenshots, maybe gameplay footage and GIFs, but that's optional, your studio description, and a short description of the game. As an example of a popular structure you'll see for many, or at least English-speaking indie games that I've seen, is a format like a web page. When you scroll down, there are trailers, screenshots, awards, and credits information. This structure is a free one made by Rami, which you can find on dopresskit.com. If you have someone on the team that knows what FTP and text editing is, it's quite quick and simple to do. I have no web dev experience, and it's pretty easy, so can vouch. And when you are writing to press, these are some things that you really want to keep in mind when you write that email to them. First is a really easy, simple email title. Avoid too many exclamation marks or caps, because a lot of email clients will mark that as spam, and you don't want that. An email title, by the way, is very difficult to do because it's similar to a game hook in that it has to be interesting enough that press want to click into it. Next, you'll have embargo information, basic game information like a genre, platforms, price, short summary, key request form, if relevant, but often for announce, not really. Make sure you link your trailer, make sure you have screenshots, social media, press kit, and someone they can contact for press. This is a sample press email. Again, I will be sending this out because I know it is quite useful to at least have some sort of template to see what a press email looks like. This is something that you would send to any size press. If you know the press person, you can personalize it towards them, which is very nice. Sometimes people will reply and say they will cover your game, which is great, but sometimes they will say that and they won't do it, which is not great. So just keep in mind that this is something that a lot of press people get. So oftentimes they're not replying, but that doesn't mean they aren't going to write about it. It doesn't mean they are going to write about it either, so just keep that in mind. This is very normal. And then, once you're announced, you'll get your first community. There is so much that goes on in marketing. So, when you're starting from scratch, your main growth channels will often be 4 different things. One is direct invites. This is how you get your first supporters, right? You probably have some sort of network when it comes to announcing your game, whether that's coworkers, colleagues, friends, family, people who watch your Twitch streams, the Discord you only awkwardly pop into sometimes, anything. These are going to be the people who support you on day one or who have seen your announcement. This is really important. They are ones that are there for you. Second is social media, so however often they find it. Third is word of mouth, so people talking about your game through events, press, and events. Again, going through events is a really good way to get outside of your bubble. And when you're inviting people into your community, you really want to give them a reason to join, whether that is giving them a direct access to talking to one of the members of the dev team, hopefully a community manager, or like saying, oh, like you can help pick the color of this game weapon. Something that just makes it a little bit more interesting for them to join and makes it less passive when they join. So there are a lot of social media platforms. This is a screenshot from Hootsuite of the most favorite social media platforms globally. The ones that are in blue are the ones that I tend to recommend for people in North America. I'm not super sure how it goes over here, because there are a lot of different social media channels out there. And obviously Twitter is sort of on fire right now. So just keep that in mind. Many people want a community before they announce, and this is incredibly difficult unless your art or something is impeccable and goes viral, for instance. But being invested in something that doesn't exist or that you don't have a firm grasp on is very near impossible for a lot of people. If you do want to post work and just to see and gauge how people are taking it and test your luck, then I would say don't worry too much about talking about the game name or the store page. Just show really early progress, so like really early game mechanics or just really gorgeous art tends to be the thing that goes viral that you see on social media. But this is not usually a strategy that I would recommend, but it is there for you in case you want to. But make sure you have at least some social media platform or something that people can go to when you do announce your game. Finally, you do get to the wait part, and this is the development time. So often people in indie games will be like, this will take a year to develop, and then 5 years later, you're still working on it. So while you're doing all of that, you do need to keep your players, your community engaged, and this is what we're working on. So building up a solid community, engaging and sustaining them, and then the activities that we tend to do with this is social media and more events. So a lot of people will ask me how much money or time they should spend on marketing. The really rough general thing, if you don't have a publisher, I would say is 25 to 50% of your production budget should go towards marketing. I'm also very biased because I work in marketing, so I do want more resources, so keep that in mind. But if you don't have that sort of money to go towards marketing, it can apply to your time, right? So if you normally spend 8 hours programming, cut that in half and spend 4 hours of it in marketing, which is something I'm sure a lot of programmers love to do. So as long as you know that and you're willing to put and invest the time, this can be very useful for you. So we usually do 4 main marketing activities. The first one I'll talk about is social media. Think of what social media platforms you will be on and very specifically have time for. Every social media platform wants you to post on it every single day, like 3-5 times a day. It's impossible unless you have a dedicated team towards it. I recommend just posting once per day and not having every single social media platform until you have the bandwidth or someone dedicated enough to do that. What social media platform you decide to go on kind of depends on what you're looking for, the effort you're willing to put in, and your own enjoyability, right? So TikTok for me, I find is quite high in effort because it's a lot of idea generation, it's a lot of video editing, it's a lot about being quick, but the strength in it is discoverability. So that is something that I really enjoy about it currently. Twitter is a little bit easier for me, though I find the strength for it to be networking with different game developers and not necessarily connecting with a lot of players, though it's still very useful for that. Reddit, if you're on it, can be quite useful and to find more hardcore fans of the game and ones that are more willing to give feedback. And Instagram is something that I found is quite useful for mobile games. Again, this all depends on you and your game, so keep that in mind. If you are looking to create a ton of content and aren't sure how you're going to do this kind of daily content, this is the structure that I use or the way my brain forms the ideas and the content breakdown. So let's say our topic is Among Us. I will break that down into 3 big categories. So game development, the setting as in the environment, and gameplay. And when I'm breaking these down, I'll put into 4 here, different kinds of topics that I can use. So game development has updates, behind the scenes, fun bugs, questions. So every single day, when I'm looking to create content or when I'm looking to plan out a whole monthly calendar, and I'm running out of ideas, I will look through this, and oftentimes you can find some sort of subject, you can recycle some sort of subject, or you can use it to your advantage. So maybe one day I'm like, all right, I'm going to talk about cosmetics, second day is fun bugs, third day is how killing works in Among Us. And the thing is like social media moves really fast. People aren't going to realize you're recycling a lot of ideas. They aren't going to notice which topics you're recycling. But the great thing about this is that by breaking it down into different topics, you can see who and what and how popular each topic is, and how you want to frame that behind any sort of social media that you're creating. And another thing about social media, of course, is it demands so much time. It is potentially an infinite hour job. So when you're working with social, when you're doing something that requires a lot of brain power, breaking it into chunks can be very easy, so you can focus your time and energy. So one of the things that I tend to like to do, and this is a really rough example. You do not have to break it down like this. So on Monday, you can generate ideas and capture the content for those ideas. So if I'm creating TikToks for Among Us, for example, I will think of my ideas for what TikToks I want to create. I will record all of the footage I need on Monday. On Wednesday, that's when I start editing the content. Everything gets edited, all the cuts, all the filters, all the voice things that I need to do. That happens on Wednesday. Again, might take 1 to 2 hours. And then on Friday, I'll start to schedule the content. So I'll be like, all right, so for the next month, this is what is happening. These are the days that make sense for it. And also you want to keep in mind, because the world changes quite a bit when you're scheduling content and if you need to shuffle things around. But this will help you stay a little bit more focused and less feeling like social media is a constant burn, even though it is. But hopefully this makes it easier. Next is press. Make sure you keep an evolving press list as you're waiting and as you're producing your game and you're seeing who's talking about what and seeing if they're playing your competitors. Make sure you keep it updated. Meet influencers where they are. Go to different events. Go to different showcases. Talk to them. Through peers, through agencies. You also want to think globally, and this is maybe more for me, but YouTube, Twitch, and TikTok aren't always the biggest content platforms, right? So depending on the region, you want to look for where they're at. Don't just look at size. Look for average video views, concurrent live viewers over 30, 60, and 90 days for games similar to yours. Sullynome is a website that a lot of people use for this. You want to reward early supporters, so the sooner you see press talking about your game, if you see an influencer really hyping up your game, make sure you note that down and have them be a part of your community. It's really nice to have them be a part of like something like launch access. And finally, build relationships. This is just good and nice to do. Game development can be very lonely, so having press and influencers in your corner is very cool. Next is events. I know I keep talking about events, but it can be quite good for you. Obviously, there are a ton. There's Busan Indie Connect, Melbourne Games Week, there's this. There's Bit Summit, there's Taipei Summer Game Show, PAX, and GDC. These are a little bit sometimes more dedicated towards other game developers, but other game developers can be a great way to kind of learn and network with other folks. When you want to talk to more like direct to consumer, oftentimes digital events are great because a lot of players, a lot of gamers don't actually tend to read reviews. They don't tend to go out of their way to find a game. They'll go to the store page and they'll hope for the best. They'll be like, all right, what's in the new and trending list? And sometimes there are specialized events that happen. So specialized Steam events like the Steam Puzzle Showcase, Ludonaricon, Steam Next Fest. There are itch.io events, which is another store page, Wholesome Snack, another thing we run, which is similar to Wholesome Direct. And then a Twitter thing called #PitchYaGame, which is a way for different indies to voluntarily show what their game is up to. It's likely that you'll want to rush to reach one of these events, whether it's this physical event or whether it's the digital events, but I wouldn't squander an opportunity to showcase your game. Remember, this is going to be the first time, potentially, many people see your game. You want to make sure that as you are showcasing your game or your studio at any event, that you are putting the full effort into it. You're going to be stacked up against different AAA titles, a lot of different indies, so make sure you have a strong announcement and assets to shine through. One of the things that I will say for demos, if you're doing that, whether at physical or digital events, is that it needs some certain things. One is that you really want it to run as smoothly as possible, right? You want the polished art, you want it to be as bug-free as possible. It is okay if it sometimes runs into that because that's the nature of demos and games, but you want to make sure it's quite polished. For a physical event, I would say end after 10 to 15 minutes of gameplay if possible, because oftentimes you want to shuffle through a lot of players trying to try out your game. If the line is too long, you might miss an opportunity. If online, 30 minutes tends to be an enjoyable one for a lot of influencers. That's up to you and your game. Make sure it represents the ideal experience of the game and have a call to action at the end. Do you want them to wishlist your game? Do you want them to follow you on social media? Do you want them to be on your newsletter? Some optional things for demos is that it ends on a cliffhanger. And for physical events, I would say cheats enabled helps because people might get stuck and you want them to go back to their place. So having cheats enabled will help you help them get to where they need to be. If it's multiplayer, make it have a single player mode. This is a very big ask, so it's okay if it doesn't have that. But a lot of the time at physical events, you have people who don't really want to play with others, or you're waiting for someone to fill up a slot and it gets a little awkward and frustrating. Next is an attract mode for physical events. This is basically when your game is on idle, you want to make sure it has a trailer that is looping through when it is idle so that it's not just there at like a main menu screen and no one actually knows what the game is. And finally, that it can work without audio in a physical event. A lot of physical events are quite loud, and people don't want to put their headphones on because it's shared by a bunch of people. So make sure it doesn't depend too much on like audio or has visual cues that can help people out. Finally, let's do a little bit of networking as part of your marketing activity. This is something that I don't think I need to push too much in terms of the importance of it, but just in case, just don't underestimate what networking can do and what listening to other people can do, right? So other developers, publishers, press, influencers, community, storefronts, and third-party platforms, if you listen to the different ways that everyone talks about your game or the things that they get interested in when you talk to them about it, can really help you define what your message is. A lot of the time, what we think is interesting and important about our game is not true for the people that we are talking to. So, for example, a great example I love about this is the game Descenders that was being published by No More Robots, I believe. Their whole shtick was that the game Descenders, which is about mountain biking down a hill, was that it was like procedurally generated, everything was different, but all that the players really cared about when they talked about it was that they were like, I love that the bike goes down a hill really fast. So that's how they had to change their marketing message to go more towards, you get to go down a hill really fast. So, really optimize, and while you are waiting to launch your game, really start optimizing your message. Listen to how people talk about your game, find the keywords, find the first impressions, and think of your end goal. Like, what do you want people to think about your game? You can't necessarily control what the end result is, but as you are tweaking, as you are learning more about how people talk about your game, this can be really helpful for you. And one of the things is that when you're the end goal of launching your game, which is what we are talking about next, is how many, like, for example, Steam wish lists do I need? Some people will say 10,000, some people will say 7,000. I would say 7,000 is maybe the minimal amount I would tend to recommend, but I wouldn't wait until you get to 7,000 if it is way past that. If you aren't going to reach that within a certain reasonable amount of time for your game and your budget. The Steam algorithm really starts to consider games at this level of like 7,000 as viable, and they'll start to promote you like automatically. But this is all based on what is also upcoming between other indie titles. So it can really depend. So 7,000, 10,000 isn't a perfect number. It's just a generic number that they will give you. All right, so that was a lot. And we are finally at launch. The great thing about launch is that you have probably done a lot of the work already in the announcement phase, in the pre-launch phase, during the wait. So hopefully this launch section will be quite easy. And this is the smallest section of my talk, so we're good. We'll have time for questions if you have it. So the goal, again, is quite similar to when we were announcing the game that exists. You have awareness and you have action as the goal. And finally, the activities, again, very similar. Trailer, a lot of hype work, a lot of press, a lot of events, and maybe a campaign. And it's going to be much more scary, so have fun with that. You'll need something like a release date trailer and a release trailer. So these are two different trailers. Again, really big marketing beats that you can use when you're pitching it to press, when you're pitching it to events. People love trailers. And the release date and the release are some of the two biggest marketing beats that you can have. Next is a good press release with keys attached and a social campaign. When I say a social campaign, it doesn't need to be anything wild. It doesn't need to be super hardcore. Just make sure that you have something planned on all of the social media platforms so that you can prepare for it. Optional are things like timing it with an event. Again, very nice to have it tied with events, especially when you're an indie, and a community sharing encouragement. Whether that is encouraging them to leave a review, whether it's encouraging them to share it to their friends and families. It's optional, but I highly, highly recommend it. So with press, make sure you send keys to them automatically. I've seen some indies try to do a strange email conversation with press or influencers to kind of work out if they should send them a key or not. If you have done your due diligence and if they seem legitimate, send them a key. Don't make it too difficult. They have a lot of things to do, as do you. I tend to give 1 to 2 weeks lead time for a review, especially a written review. This is better if it's 2 weeks. So I've heard from press, but at least a week, hopefully. Influencers who are just playing your game, you can give them less time when you're giving them the keys, especially if you're a little bit afraid they'll break embargo. But make sure you have a very clear embargo. Make sure you put the time zone, because a lot of the time if people break it, some people may get a little bit annoyed when that happens, especially if maybe you've promised press a very certain tidbit of the game. And this is something when you're talking to press or influencers that can be really great, especially if you don't have a sponsorship budget necessarily, is if you give them a very small exclusive or a big exclusive when it comes to your game. Maybe they get the first look. Maybe they get a certain demo portion. Things like that is really helpful for press and for influencers because it motivates them more to hopefully share something about your game and write about your game. Again, because there is so much out there, there are so many indie games pitching their game, that having a little bit of special something can be very helpful for you. One of the things is to also make sure that you have a strong social push. I recommend planning at least a month's worth of content, showing off different aspects of the game, both in the month and week leading up to it, as in the month leading up to it, and then the week having really strong social media coverage and making sure you're tracking that like crazy. And then a month afterwards, making sure that you have content planned. I say like 2 months worth of content in advance because oftentimes you'll be very busy doing other things. You'll be busy working with press, you'll be busy making sure that questions are answered, maybe you'll be setting up for an event, and then afterwards, when all of the hype is happening, you'll be really busy checking out all the streamers, you'll be making sure that the bugs aren't super, super bad, hopefully. Or maybe it's all great and it's running smoothly. Either way, having that plan, that social content plan, 2 months in advance, even though it can be very difficult, will be great for your brain and make sure you have time to respond to the community, talk to them, and really be a part of the hype cycle. Engage all of your social channels, all of the ones that you have. You can possibly do giveaways or contests. I tend to not like those. For many different reasons, but also just because it tends to be quite a lot of work for not very clear return on investment, but that is my experience. Maybe it is better for you. And also, you will want to, during the week of launch and maybe the week after, is to have the development team really ready to respond to any technical inquiries you may get from the community. A lot of bugs, a lot of problems tend to crop up during this time, so making sure that you get dedicated time from the programming team, for example, will really help you and your team and the ways that players interact with you seem much more positive when you can get to their questions and their issues quickly. One of the things that I love to do is obviously as a community director is work with community and players. So community sharing, especially during the wait time, if you've interacted with them, if you've engaged with them, if you've shown that you care and that you want to listen to what they're doing, is when it is launch time, asking for their help. Encourage reviews. This is something that any store algorithm loves, is to have those reviews. Don't bribe them to give you a positive review, that's not good and usually against all of the terms of services. Just ask for a review, an honest review, because even a negative review can really help you out and figure out what you need to tweak, possibly in a patch, possibly in a DLC. Highlight any gameplay moments. People love it when they see that the developer is noticing them and sharing their gameplay moments. This is something that really will connect you with your different players and hopefully make them fans of your game and your studio for a long time. And you can make a second game, you can make a third game, and they'll be around. Just acknowledging and being heard and seen is something that anyone, whether you're a gamer, whether you're a developer, whether you're just a person, is something that is really important. And showing up in live streams for influencers is a really great way to network with them. Even if you don't necessarily, and I have done this, even if you don't necessarily speak their language, just showing up and trying to interact with them using Google Translate or speaking in English and having like the Google Translate next to it can be really nice and really helpful just to, again, encourage that sort of sharing and that connection when it comes to developers and the gamers and the influencers and the press, is to make that effort. All of community, all of marketing is just putting in effort to connect with people, and I think that's an amazing thing that you can do, especially when it is game launch, when you're really excited and a lot of things are happening. Again, there's no guarantee though. It's a really long talk for something that is difficult. Marketing isn't some magical, beautiful thing that can make anything successful. It can help quite a bit, but it's going to be tough, especially if it is your first indie game. That being said, it is not necessarily impossible either. Knowing your strengths and weaknesses and knowing the more that you do something, the more you'll understand and be able to work with it will be amazing. Even if you are working with a publisher and you think, great, now I don't have to think about marketing, I don't have to think about business development, I don't have to think about press, I don't have to think about influencers. Ripping that knowledge away from you and how you can form your game, future titles, how your publisher is doing, because there are a lot of publishers out there who will say they will do things and not actually do them, and you want to make sure they are doing it relatively well, is something that is really important, especially as an indie game developer. You don't want to be taken advantage of that way. So at least doing some of the marketing or exploring about it and being curious about players, their motivations, their intentions, how you can talk to them can be really, really exciting and really positive experience. Yeah, so you got this. I believe in you. And thank you for listening to my talk. There should be time for questions.
今天我们的讲师有特别留一点时间给大家做 Q&A 哦。那现在有没有人想要问问题可以上台哦？到麦克风前面对。
I just want to ask, when you say 50% of the budget, do you mean if I have $100, I should spend 50 on marketing, or do you say I have $100 developing again and I should add another $50 to the marketing?
Yeah, so you would have $150,000 to spend on it, hopefully. So if you had $100,000 on production and you want to spend you want a strong marketing budget, I would say add on $50,000. So $150,000 to your entire thing.
Understood. Thank you.
Okay, so from what I remember, the Among Us was released in 2018, but the hype kicks in 2 years later. So did you guys do anything special in 2019 to make this happen? Because it feels like one night I was sleeping and look, oh, Among Us, this game looks good. And when I wake up, everyone says, you look kind of sus to me. I don't know what happened.
Yeah, so the way Among Us got popular is a very strange and not recommended story of stubbornness, I suppose. But Among Us, the way Among Us got popular is a very strange coincidence of events, right? So first, it did release in 2018, and it did okay. Some people think it completely flopped. It didn't completely flop. It did all right for us overseas. So it did pretty good in Korea, for example. And this was because at the time, they were, Marcus Bromander, who is one of our co-founders, was on newgrounds.com, which is a website for like Flash games. And he was quite popular there. So he already had sort of a small community there. But also to itch.io, which is a store page, saw it and asked if we wanted to be featured. And we were like, sure, why not? What can hurt from it, from being featured on a store page? Just because it was doing relatively well overseas. From that, I think we had our first major Korean streamer find it, play it with a few of his friends, and it grew from there. And then at some point, because it was doing relatively well numbers from the itch.io thing and from the streamers, Steam took notice of it and was like, do you want to be part of the daily deal sale? We said yes. The game was 50% off. And I think we got, in that weekend, we got the entirety, sorry, this is a really long answer. We got the entirety of, I think, a few months worth of sales in that weekend. And from there, it just kept building on, right? So it was a positive turn of events of another streamer in Europe saw it, and that's how we got more into Western countries from people. It was a lot of streamers inviting their friends to play. And streamers inviting their friends to play means a lot of people are watching, more people are talking about Among Us, more people are noticing. Suddenly we're in the summer game sale. More people are buying it because it's quite cheap and it's available on a lot of different platforms. It's easy to pick up. A pandemic happened and people were trying to find places to connect. So a lot of different things happened that I can't say you could replicate necessarily in that exact order. But yes.
Is there any downside for growing so rapidly?
Yes. So many downsides.
Oh, wow.
It's horrible. No. Well, one, a really small team having millions of players for a game that wasn't built to host millions of players means the game had been breaking down constantly and a lot of technical debt. Like, we are still dealing with technical debt 3 years later into the game, which makes it really difficult, and why they wanted to make an Among Us 2, but then that's a whole complicated thing. Another is scaling your team, so now we're hiring on more team members, but when you hire on more team members, suddenly you need people management. And then a lot of players demanding different things and thinking their issues are the most important. There's a lot of things.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. I'm from a company that makes games, and I want to ask you, first of all, thank you for your amazing and comprehensive speeches. And I want to ask your perspective of the things below. Since Among Us is a very successful game, so after your launch and your success, there's a lot of games that have same gameplay, and they try to like invade your community, like leaving some message. Like, I like Among Us, so I would like to recommend other games like your game. So how do you think about this situation?
It's good. Honestly, we go into the mindset of having competitors is good. It's the thing that creates a lot of growth. Direct clones are a little bit more like, oh, that makes us more sad. But having competitors and having people change up the idea, and we weren't the first social deduction game, right? There are a lot of different kinds of games out there. But having people kind of play on that is really exciting because we love the genre. That's why we made a game that was in that genre. And also just being able to, especially in the indie game space, work with others is really exciting and motivates us to create more things that we hope our players will enjoy. And honestly, having more competitors means we don't have the peak amount of players that we had, which is great in its own sense because it lessens the burden on all of the servers, but also really helps us find our core players and how we can work with them and how we can bring in new players because there's always going to be new people to play.
Thanks for your answering. Hello, Victoria. Thanks for your great speech. I learned a lot from that.
Yeah.
And I have two questions. And the first one is how to keep your audience, like your players, keep interested with your game, but without letting everything in your game being shown on the community. Mm-hmm. And that is my first question. And my second question is, what can be done if the communities start to become less active?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so two very good questions. So the first question, let me summarize again, is, oh my goodness, is how to, sorry, can you say that again? How to keep players interested?
Yeah, but without showing everything in your game being seen. Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the things I like to do is the trailer, like cutting it up and showing off really certain cycles of it can be very interesting and nice, but depending on what your game is, and I face this with a lot of games that have spoilers, often what the best thing to do is, if you don't want to spoil too many parts of the game, is have like a section of the game that you are totally okay with spoiling, or at least having things shared about, and being able to talk about the different themes around it. Whether it's the characters, whether it's the setting that they're in, whether it is a certain story beat that you just talk about again and again. And with social media, people will tend to forget things, and being able to recycle that can be very helpful. But it is still going to be quite a bit of struggle, like no matter what, for sure, especially if you can't talk about new things or spoil it. So another way is talking about game bugs, talking about the game development process. But very specifically, I would say just try and work with the themes that you have, and talking to players about those themes and kind of working around it. But it is going to be difficult. And the second one was what to do if it gets quiet in your community space.
Yeah, sometimes when after your game is launched, and the activity of the community will start going to rising a little bit and then slower.
Yes, and that's very natural, right? It's going to be hard, especially if your game isn't necessarily like, for example, like Among Us, like a live service game. If it's just a single player narrative game, for example, it has an ending, and then after launch it kind of peters out. That's quite normal. There's not too much you can do necessarily to quotation mark save that unless you have updates planned like a DLC or something. But ways that you can keep them engaged, and this is part of the whole community building aspect, is after a game launch, people tend to stay because of the different friendships or relationships or connections that they've made in the space that you've created, whether that's a Discord, whether that's a Twitter, whether that's some other social media platform. One way I usually encourage people to stay engaged is to either, if they're around and you're working on your second game and you need opinions on something, and not necessarily promise people that their opinions will be part of it, but just asking them, like, what do you think of this? Or if you don't want to spoil anything about your game, your next game, or the DLC or anything, just posing different questions, because people love giving their expertise, is something that can be quite helpful. But also when it comes to the game itself, and maybe you just want to encourage more eyes to go towards your game, is to, one, again, show their own gameplay moments and show off really small details potentially about the game that people might have not noticed, or little fun facts that can help people get and stay interested. But again, something that a lot of people constantly work on, and that's why there's people that you hire, like me or a community manager, to constantly keep people engaged and to be there for them to kind of discuss the game with and discuss other games with potentially.
Okay, thank you.
好，那我们就掌声再次谢谢我们的讲师 Victoria Tran。